All right, well, welcome everybody, and appreciate you all showing up here today. And I know many of you probably came here to see John and Martha, so I'm going to start with apologies, and these are straight from John and Martha. Unfortunately, John was ill. He came down with COVID actually, and it was just last week, so he's still recovering, and made the decision over the weekend not to come out to Oshkosh this year. And so unfortunately, they did not make it, and unfortunately, you got me instead. But I'm going to do my best. I'm going to deliver a presentation maybe similar to what John and Martha would give. And it's something that I've put together in just a couple days, knowing that I need to do this. But I think it covers some really important issues, and hopefully gives you some tools to help manage risk and make your flying safer. And you know, when I was a young whippersnapper, just starting out learning to fly back in the dark ages, and it has been a few years, but I really admired the sage CFIs that were in my circle, and I had a chance to learn from, and I learned a lot from them. And I remember one day, one of the wizened old CFIs, you know, that had really been around for a while and knew what was going on, was in the office, and I came up and I thought, well, I have to figure out a question to ask. You know, what am I going to ask him? And so I thought about it some more, and I asked him, you know, what is the hardest thing in flying? And he thought about it for a few minutes, and meanwhile, I'm kind of anxiously waiting for this little drip of wisdom, of nectar to come down my way. And finally, he looked up, looked me in the eye, deadpan, and said, the hardest thing in flying is the ground. Oh, well, okay, well, it sounded good. But later, as I became more experienced, I realized that it's not just the ground, it's how you end up meeting the ground. And as many of you know, what's the old adage? Any good landing is a landing you can walk away from, right? And how about a great landing? Does everybody know what a great landing is? You can use the airplane again, exactly. So my wish for all of you is that you have nothing but great landings. If you don't have a great landing, at least make it a good one. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is try and give you some tools to consider the risks of flying and to make your flying as risk-free, or at least as risk-managed as possible. So how many people in this room are pilots? Well, that's just about everybody. How many are CFIs? A lot of CFIs in the room. That's great. Well, I have to tell you that you're not normal. And what do I mean by you're not normal? Well, you've been through a tremendous amount of training, learning, ground school. You've been examined multiple times and persevered through all of that to become pilots. So what does that say about this group? It says that you're goal-oriented, and you set out to do something and you accomplish what you set out to do. And that's a wonderful thing, but it can also work against us as pilots. That goal orientation is something that we need to have tools to work against and prevent it from taking us down a road that we don't want to go and end up having a not so good landing. So, you know, a great example of this is, how many of you can relate to this scenario? So you're going down a 2-lane road, right? And you've been going for like a half hour, you have an hour drive to do, and you're passing semi-trucks, and you passed about 20 semi-trucks, and you're like, man, this is great, I'm winning, right? And then your passenger in the car starts to talk about the need to go to the bathroom. It's like, oh my God, really? That now? And eventually you have to end up succumbing, right? So you pull over to the gas station, and while they're in the bathroom, you start watching the road, and semi going by, right? How do you feel about that? It's like, oh my gosh. And in the end effect, you get to your destination 5 minutes later than you planned, right? So was all that stress really worthwhile? And and that's one of the things that I think that as pilots, because piloting and flying really selects goal-oriented people and people that like to accomplish things in life, it's something that we have to also watch out for, and we need some tools to help us watch out for it. So the big question is GA flying safe? Does anybody have an answer to that? And any thoughts? It's a tough question, isn't it? Is it safe? Does safety really matter in terms of a word? Is it safe?
Depends on the pilot and the airplane.
Depends on the pilot and the airplane. Yeah, I think so. And I think that's the big question. So I cringe a little bit. It's happened to me occasionally I might be at a party and somebody will come up to me and say, "Hey, so and so said you're a pilot and a flight instructor, and you do all these good flying things." Well, I've got this friend of mine that has a small airplane, and they want me to go fly with them. And I'm really worried about these little airplanes. Are they safe? And I think about it, and that's a tough question to answer, right? How would you answer that? Think about it. Are the airplanes safe?
I tell people that ask me that it's safe as driving a motorcycle.
Right.
Generally.
And I think that's
Less than a vehicle, a car, less protection in that.
in statistics, because really the word safety doesn't stand alone, right? It kind of has to be relative to something, right? You can't just say, is it safe, right? So, and what makes me cringe a little bit when they ask me that question is their focus is on the airplane. They're worried about, is the airplane safe? And my thought in figuring out how to respond to that is airplanes are really safe. So, I want to give them that message, but what I want to tell them beyond that is that airplanes are safe, pilots are variable, right? Especially in GA. So if you want to judge whether or not you should go flying on this mission, really you need to look at the person who's asking. And if you know them well, it's helpful because you might know how they conduct their life in general. You might have seen them drive, for instance. How do they go about driving and managing the risks of driving? How do they go about living their life? Are they reckless or are they measured and careful in what they do? Because being more measured and careful is something that makes flying safer. So it's a relative thing, but my answer to that question is usually take a look at the pilot, because most accidents are the result of pilot error. They're not the result of aircraft failure. So that's really my answer there. So really what we need to do as an industry is we need to have very honest discussions about safety. They're particularly important in GA, because in GA we don't have a lot of the health that pilots have that are working in 135 operations or 121 operations. When we're operating under Part 91, we generally don't have dispatchers. We don't have SOPs or second crew members. We don't have the stricter regulations that require us to meet certain requirements before we make a flight. We have a lot more freedom, and that's a wonderful thing, right? We have more freedom, especially in the United States, than just about anywhere in the world, to fly places that we want to go and under conditions that sometimes can be marginal but are legal. And so it's really up to us, and it's the most important person in the world for us to be honest to is ourselves, right? So it pays off to spend some time thinking about the amount of risk we're willing to take in flying. But for decades, we've been telling ourselves the big lie. Does anybody know what the big lie is? Any thoughts? Well, this is one that John and Martha often talk about. So it's come from them. And really, the big lie is telling ourselves that the most dangerous part of the trip was the drive to the airport, right? And I know I've actually used that. I remember telling that to somebody, and it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but it's also something that is an intellectual dishonesty because it's not true. It's not true. In reality, GA fatalities per mile are not nearly as good as driving a car. And they're more on a par, as you said, with riding a motorcycle, right? And people ride motorcycles all the time and enjoy riding motorcycles. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a risk versus reward, right? And we always have those trade-offs we're making in life, and we have those trade-offs when we're flying. How much risk are we willing to accept for how much reward we get? And that reward might be getting to a destination, it might be just enjoying and personal fulfillment in what we're doing. So I don't think that it's a bad thing necessarily, that it's more dangerous than driving a car. A lot of things we do are more dangerous than we do them. I ride motorcycles. I raced motorcycles off the road for many years. That was a risky thing to do, but I got a lot of reward from it. So I accepted the risk. And so I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with it. I think what's wrong with it is when we're not honest with ourselves. Because being honest with ourselves stimulates us to do something to improve the safety, to improve the risk. And that's where we want to get to, right? So perpetuating these intellectual dishonesties isn't a good thing. They tend to end the discussion, right? It's like it doesn't allow you to go anywhere else to talk about it. And they substitute for thoughtfulness. So is it safe? Well, let's take a look at the actual numbers. And GA accidents, how many per year? There's about 1,000 per year, 200 of which are fatal. It's a big country, a lot of pilots. That comes down to put it into something that's a little bit easier to relate to, about 9.5 fatal accidents per million flight hours. In that context, it doesn't sound quite as significant, but it is 14 times greater than driving. So it's significantly more dangerous than driving. And then the next question is, and this kind of relates back to that person asking me, is it safe to fly with this friend of mine that has this little airplane? How many of those accidents are related to error in risk management? Well, about 75% are pilot related. So by far and away the majority, right? So if we're looking at things, where do we want to increase the safety of our flying, we need to look to ourselves. So in the flight training industry, a lot of you are CFIs, we actually do much better, right? Only about 2.3 fatal accidents per million hours of flight training. That's not too bad. But the 2.3 goes to 9.5 when pilots leave the nest. So why is that? Well, we may have acquired the skills, but we may not have developed the habits that lead to successfully identifying and mitigating risks. And so when your students leave the nest and go out flying, the question to ask is, have you given them tools to make their own flying as safe as they were under your wings? And of course, that's what you're trying to do, right? That's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to give them not just the skills and the knowledge, but also the risk management. And that's in the latest ACS. Why is it in the latest ACS? Well, one of the reasons is that John King was sitting on the ARC that was interacting with FAA on the development of the ACS and really pushed for risk management being part of it. So that's considering and mitigating risk. And now DPs are required to ask about risk management in addition to the knowledge and tasks. And I think that's been a really good change. But the question is, there's not a lot of guidance that's given in the ACS about how to teach risk management, how to get somebody to the point of being a good risk manager. So we want to talk a little bit about that today. So the first thing is we need to improve our vocabulary, and we need to improve the effectiveness of our discussions about safety and spend time thinking about it, right? Talking about somebody's judgment or safety doesn't provide any guidance. And in fact, words like judgment are kind of loaded words, right? You don't want to tell somebody, oh, you have bad judgment, right? Because it's not going to be received very well. What you want to do is focus on the ideas of how can you transmit some tools that they can use. That's really what we want to talk about today. Going somewhere is a risky behavior. There's no doubt about it. You're safest, most likely, not that it's absolutely risk-free, but you're safest in your bed in the morning before you get up, right? Once you get out of bed, you start this series of activities, and all of those activities have risk-reward associated with them. So your risk during the day goes up and down, and hopefully you're getting a lot of reward for the risks that you're taking in life. May not be big risks. And we're talking about risk. We're talking about risk of injury or risk of dying, right? So it would always be safer to stay put. Doing anything in an aircraft always requires a trade-off between risk and the desired result. And the old saying is, a ship is safest in the harbor, but that's not what ships are made for, right? They're made to go out and do something. And that's the same case with us as pilots and our airplanes. We want to go out and get fulfillment from using them. So we're going to accept some risk. There's no doubt about it. But can those risks be managed? Well, here's the spoiler alert for the presentation, is yes, of course they can be managed, like anything else. We just need some thoughtfulness applied to it. And we can make our flying much safer than those odds that we saw of 9.5 accidents per million flight hours. There's no doubt. That of course, is of overall averages. If you look at the population of pilots, you're going to find pilots that have much lower chances of having a fatal accident than others. And it depends on how they're doing on managing risk. So risk is what we want to talk about. The word risk gives us something to talk about, kind of like the old Bonnie Raitt song, right? Let's give them something to talk about. Well, risk, when we talk about with other pilots, that gives us something that we can talk about because it's kind of objective. There's risks and things that we can talk about in terms of how we reduce the likelihood of that risk happening. So the discussion is more like, well, what are the risks in doing that? Oh yeah, there's risks. What can we do to mitigate those? So we're going to talk about risk management as a proactive habit of identifying and mitigating risks. And I'm using the word habit because habits are so powerful. And we need to make risk management a habit. So when we talk about habit and the value of good habits, habits really free up the brain, right? They arise in triggering circumstances without any effort on our part. There's good habits and there's bad habits. You know, in my mind, smoking's a bad habit. It's for me. But you know, if you look at people that smoke, there's certain triggers that trigger that habit, right? And it might be having a drink or what have you. There's a trigger that generates a response, right? So the value of good habits is that they free up the brain. You don't have to think about a habit. It just happens. And you know, a great example of this, is there anybody in this room that was alive and around before automobiles had seatbelts? Yeah, I was kind of on the edge of that time, right? So we went from automobiles not having seatbelts, but what a great safety feature to add a seatbelt to cars. And of course, they started out as being optional equipment, right? You didn't have to use a seatbelt. You actually paid more for a seatbelt if you wanted one. And but we went from that point to where we are today. And when you get in a car today, you sit down and it's an automatic movement, right? You just reach over, you grab the seatbelt, you put it on. You don't even think about having done it. You probably wouldn't even remember that you had done it, right? Because it's that automatic. And it's automatic to the point of, you know, let's say that you're in a rush to get somewhere, right? Like, let's say your wife is about to have your first baby in this labor, you know, is in labor and we're rushing to get to the hospital. You know, you load her up on the one side, you jump in the car, and you're just trying to do everything. You're goal-oriented straight on to the hospital. Are you going to forget to put on your seatbelt? Very unlikely, right? Because it's a habit. You sit in the driver's seat and you pull that seatbelt across and you latch it. And it's that strong of a habit that no matter how goal-oriented you are, how many other things you have on your mind, how focused you are, you do it. And risk management needs to be that kind of a habit. It needs to be a habit in our flying, right? And because risk can break the chain of thoughts that may have you entirely focused on completing a mission and not considering any of the other input that's coming in. But the habits can trigger those second thoughts. So I like to think about risk management as a habit, as developing it as a habit. So even when the external pressures are strong, a habit will remind you to look for risk. And reading NTSB reports, you'll see that in a lot of cases, pilots are so focused on the goal, on the destination, that they let a lot of things go that should have triggered some sort of a response. So with flying habits, instructors are always looking to build good habits into their students and weed out the bad ones, right? We're always looking for that. It's like, because we know laws of primacy and things like that that we learned through the FOI, and so we want to develop those good habits right from the beginning and weed out the bad ones. But most often those habits are about flying skills. But in order to get pilots their Master Pilot Award, does everybody know what the FAA Master Pilot Award is? It's an award you can apply for from the FAA after having been a pilot for 50 years without any major accidents or any issues. But if you've been a pilot and lived through it for 50 years, you can apply for the Master Pilot Award. So we want to get our pilots that Master Pilot Award, right? We want to give them the tools right from the beginning that's going to get them there. So the best area is to build those good habits around risk surveillance and management. So how do we go about building this habit of looking for and thinking about risk? Well, really, before we go into a lot of detailed work, I think there's one habit, one recurring thought habit that needs to be instilled. And that is, our future life is more important than reaching our destination today. And I don't know, probably most of the pilots in here have not reached their destination for one reason or another. Things changed, and they ended up diverting, went somewhere else, or just decided not to go that day. And I've done that, and at the time it seemed like such a big deal. It was like, oh my God, I'm not going to make it. This is a disaster, and there's a lot of emotional content as somebody who's goal-oriented, and you're saying you're not going to be able to meet your goals. Oh my God. A week later, you can't even remember what the big rush was or why you were going there, right? Things tend to not be as important as time goes by as they seem in the moment. So one recurring thought habit that you could develop is, my future life is more important than getting to my destination today. There's going to be plenty more opportunities, and whatever changes in your life you have to make, even if you have to get a hotel at a place that you diverted to or what have you, in a few weeks it won't matter. You won't even remember. So if you can develop that kind of a thought habit, that'll give you more freedom in order to make that decision that is going to potentially save your life, save the airplane, or just cause a lot of stress that we don't really need in our lives. So that's one to think about. But creating habitual risk management surveillance using SOP-driven briefings is what I'm going to recommend. And this is really what I'm headed to and wanting to talk about today. So what's an SOP? SOPs provide a context for briefing, standard operating procedures, right? And when we're flying, bigger aircraft, two crew operations, Part 135, Part 121, we have SOPs, right? SOPs, standard operating procedures, are things that you will comply with. They're stated, they're agreed to, you know ahead of time, you're going to never get any flack by following an SOP, right? So in some ways, they're also a way out from certain things. But as GA pilots, we have so much freedom, we don't necessarily take the time to develop our own standard operating procedures, but we would benefit from doing so. So I would suggest making your own SOPs written. These are my flying SOPs. These are the ones that I'm going to live by. And those SOPs should include at least personal minimums and risk briefings. So everybody understands what personal minimums are? Is there anybody here? Right? So probably your flight instructor back at some time, or maybe you yourself came about it to develop these personal minimums. It might have to do with the amount of wind you're willing to accept for a landing, for takeoff. Just these are the minimums that I need to have, which hopefully are a little step above the regulatory minimums, right? And they recognize maybe issues of currency and what have you, and set a little bit higher standard for yourself. And it might be you only land with an hour of fuel on a VFR flight instead of a half hour of fuel. It's a good personal minimum. I feel comfortable with that one. So the development of personal minimums, I think, is a really important part and can be kind of the cornerstone of your own standard operating procedures. The next one that I would recommend in having in your own standard operating procedures are the idea of risk briefings. So what am I talking about with risk briefings? I'm talking about specific points in time where you're going to brief yourself about the flight that's coming up, that you're contemplating, that you're about to take, and then when you're in the air. So we're going to have 3 risk briefings that I'm going to describe today. And those are really important, but repetition is the key to develop any habit. So why can a 20-hour student remember and pre-flight a Cessna 172 blindfolded, right? And instructors know after a few times of student going out and going through pre-flight and what have you, they've got it down pretty good. But after they've had 20 flight lessons or so, yeah, they could do it in their sleep, right? Because they've had a repetition of doing it. And risk management briefings can be the same thing. If they're just taught but not practiced, the habit's not developed, right? So I would recommend, especially as flight instructors, as being NAFI, that right from the beginning, going through with our students, that we go through these 3 briefings every time. And that repetition will carry on past their time with you as a flight instructor. And it'll carry on into their flying. And the more years that go by, the more automatic it will become. And you'll see as we go through the value that these briefings can have. So the importance of the briefing is to stop, look for, and mitigate the risk. So the 3 briefings as SOPs can establish this habit of looking for and mitigating risk. And the ones that I recommend are, before going to the airplane, PAVE. How many people have worked with PAVE, knows that acronym? Most have. So PAVE can work out really well. And I say before going to the airplane because that's the time when your goal orientation has not fully kicked in yet, right? Once you've made an investment in walking out to the airplane, loading your stuff, pre-flighting, you're kind of in go mode, right? You've invested something, and by default, you're going, right? So I think before going to the airplane, go through and do the PAVE. Before takeoff chord, in the air, when something goes wrong, care. And we'll go through those and make sure that everybody understands what they are. So paving your way to a safe flight is really identifying those risks in advance, and planning the mitigation of the risk. So really, when we're talking about risk management, I think it's important to note that we're not using risk management to try and make a go, no-go decision. It's not an absolute. What we're trying to do is reduce the risk by mitigating, by taking some type of a strategy, which when we look at the risk, say, well, how can we make it less likely that risk will happen? So we'll take a look at those as we go through. So pave your way to a safe flight is the first one. So what are those? You're putting your risks into categories, and those categories are pilot, aircraft, environment, which is a little bit of a stretch, and external and internal pressures. And this was another one that back in the day, John and Martha were working with the FAA on the development of this PAVE checklist. And fortunately, it's taken and it's carried on into a lot of the aircraft flying handbook and other places where you can reference it. But I think they're great categories, and we'll go through each one of those. So as I said, they're not go, no-go. They're designed to help you identify risks and mitigate them by changing the flight if you need to. So on the pilot side, we're asking the questions, are we qualified and proficient on this aircraft, on the instruments, on the night, if we're flying at night, are we night current and proficient flying at night? So we're just doing a little bit of a self-evaluation. And are we physically ready? And to answer that question, the FAA has provided another nice checklist that we can use, and that's called the I Am Safe checklist. And probably most of you are very aware of this checklist. But very good to go through it, having to do with, are you feeling well? Have you had any illness recently? Medication? Because we know that illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, food, strong emotions, they all impact our ability to recognize risk and to be able to manage the risk. one that comes up to mind, and I hate to ask this question, but I'm going to, and it's one that John and Martha often ask. And raise your hand if you know personally somebody who's been killed in an aircraft. Does anybody know personally somebody? Raise your hand if you know somebody personally who's been killed in an auto accident. There's a couple of them, but not nearly as many as have been killed in an aircraft accident, where you know somebody personally. Well, personal story for me is I had a neighbor that had a Mooney and was flying regularly out to the desert from San Diego. You cross over this mountain range between San Diego and the desert. And he had recently had a good friend that had passed away and was emotionally upset and was dealing with that loss. And he thought a great way for him to kind of get himself together was to fly out to his place out in the desert and spend some time in solitude, right, and thinking about it and what have you. The problem was that mental state was not a great one to manage the risks of flying, right? So he crossed the main mountain ridge, and it turned out there's a second ridge en route to his destination airport, which was Borrego Springs. And so he comes up over the top of the first ridge and sees the lights of Borrego Springs. It was night, another risk factor, right? Sees the lights of the airport, sees the airport, I'm sure. I mean, we can't ask him, unfortunately, because what happened is he was descending for the airport, and he probably had the airport in sight all the way to the point that he descended into that second ridge and had a controlled flight into terrain accident. One of the highest categories of accidents that we have, right? Now, I firmly believe, because he's flown that route so often, and he knows about that second ridge and what have you, and you know, I was very aware of his flying skills, which were high, but he was in an emotional state that wasn't safe, and he probably wasn't thinking correctly. So that is just saying to give a sense of importance in our own personal state of mind when we go flying. You know, as GA pilots, we're out there flying most of the time as a single pilot in the aircraft, right? We don't have somebody who's watching us and catching our mistakes. And flying in a two-pilot operation, as I have the opportunity to do with John and Martha and with my wife Virginie here, we flew the Falcon out here to Oshkosh. You have somebody who's there to catch your mistakes, and it's a great thing, and it happens on a regular basis. And I'm not saying I wouldn't have caught those mistakes necessarily on myself, but having somebody else point them out is a great safety feature. So we have to be our own pilot monitoring, right? We have to have our primary person who's flying the airplane, but we really need this other person out there who's the pilot monitoring, right, and watching us. It comes to mind this, you know, you've probably all seen these old cartoons where you have these two thought bubbles, right? There's a devil in one, and there's an angel in the other one, right? And they're arguing back together as the person's trying to figure out whether or not they're going to do something that they really want to do, but they know it's not, you know, the right thing to do. And so we kind of need that angel and devil that are working, and we need some rules about how they work together, and some things like the I'm Safe checklist and the other checklists we're going to talk about. That if you decided that this is the way I'm going to operate as my SOP, then that's giving that angel a lot of power, right? It's saying, when things were less stressful and when we were sitting around talking and thinking about how we were going to manage situations like this is what we decided. So that when you get into the situation where they're arguing, it's like, hey, hold it, we decided already about that we're not going to go if we don't think that we can land with an hour of fuel reserve, right? So you have to kind of think about these things a little bit ahead of time and give them enough weight and power that they can sway the moment. And that's something that we need to look at. So that's a little bit of an aside from I'm Safe, and a little bit more about just risk management in general and how we need to approach it. So the physical ready part, aircraft, we need to take a look at the aircraft and make sure it's capable of the route that we're planning on flying. If that route's going over high terrain especially, it's a great example. Is that airplane really capable of getting over that terrain? And how much margin do I have? You know, if I need to climb, am I going to be able to? So those types of things. Density, altitude, another good thing to think about. So range, load, conditions, is it the right airplane for the mission that I'm planning? And this is another case where we can start thinking about mitigation. You know, if you're renting an airplane from a flight school or from a flying club, is there another airplane that I could take that's more capable and would give a greater margin of safety on this trip? And if I'm not checked out in that airplane, well, maybe I shouldn't be flying this trip if it's the right one and I'm trying to fit the airplane that I have into the mission, which really requires something more. And it might be a good stimulus to go out, get checked out in that higher performance airplane, right? Increase your margin of safety by having a little bit more horsepower or turbocharging or whatever you need in that case. Maybe it's a more capable instrument platform with more information and more ways to have good situational awareness. So we look at the aircraft, we look at the environment, and that includes weather, terrain, airspace, day or night, and look at each one of these things and ask ourselves, you know, is this environment something that I'm capable of flying in, or is it something that we need to do something about? And weather might be things where you're going to, you know, make this a two-leg trip instead of a one-leg trip to go around weather, instead of saying, well, I'm going to go through it. It might be something like, you know, the thought might come to mind that, you know, there's an overcast out there, but it's 4,000 feet. I can just stay underneath it and make my way to the destination. One of the number one leading cause of GA accidents is VFR flight into IMC, right? And that kind of thinking is what leads to a lot of those accidents, because generally what will happen if the weather's already different than what's forecast, you have a lower ceiling or something where you're trying to mitigate and work around it, it's probably going to get worse. So folks will take off, they'll start out with that, it's a good idea, we're staying underneath, I can see all the terrain, but then the visibility starts going down, right? Then the cloud ceiling starts dropping a little bit, starts getting harder to see. That would be a good time to maybe turn around and go somewhere else, but unfortunately, that's not always what happens. We push on, we tend to use that goal orientation, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more as we come up here. External, internal pressures. This is probably the biggest one to consider, because this is the one that will make you ignore all the rest, right? This is the one, it's our internal drive, that even when we recognize that there's certain risks, that internal pressure is the thing that says, it's going to be all right. We'll get to our destination, right? And that's the one that we have to pay a lot of attention to. So when we go through the checklist, we get to this one, we go, oh, hold it, I've got all these external pressures that are really pushing me. You might want to go back and go through all the other ones again. The second thing that you should do is think about, what can I do about those external pressures? And one of the ones that, you know, this is just an example of mitigation. So let's say that you're flying to destination to visit family. And you've told the family, oh, I'm going to be at the airport for 2 o'clock, right? So get up in the air, you're flying, you start to get into some situation where you're going to need to divert, and the thought comes to mind, oh, I told them to meet us at the airport. They're going to be sitting there waiting for us, worried about us if we arrive late. And that can be a pressure that drives you toward your original plan. So you want to be careful about that. So mitigation, that can be mitigated, right? You just tell them, hey, we're going to be there around 2 o'clock. I'll give you a call when we get to the airport. We've got to, you know, take care of the airplane, get it fueled, tie it down, and everything anyway. You know, maybe they're 15 minutes away to drive. No problem. You know, we'll let you know when we land, and you come out. By the time you get there, we'll be ready to go. So that's a very simple mitigation thing, but it takes some thoughtfulness, right, to think about that type of risk and that type of mitigation. Most likely the flight will go exactly as planned, and you'll show up at 2 o'clock. And if you're like me, you like to have a little bit of time after a flight anyway to think about the flight, to think about, and maybe debrief if you have another pilot on board, and talk about what went wrong, what went right, what could I do better next time. It's nice to have that little bit of time anyway, so you'll probably be appreciative of the fact that you're the folks that are picking you up are not standing there waiting, and the moment you show up at the airport, they, jump on the airplane and what have you. So in any case, that's just an example of the type of mitigation that you can do. So external and internal pressures, you need to identify and mitigate your own external and internal pressures. And those are going to be different for everybody. But as I said, the danger is that that's the one that can make you ignore all others. So I would pay attention to that one. So now we've gone through PAVE, we've mitigated some risks, we're like, okay, things are good to go. We have a couple of other briefings that I would suggest adding to your SOP. And I use the word briefings because it's a good aviation term, right? We brief things, we brief approaches, we brief our takeoff plans. If we have two pilots, usually there's a captain's brief that happens. And that captain's brief will often happen after startup, during taxi. I'm going to go over just the parameters of the takeoff that you're about to make. And that's the chord briefing that I'm going to talk about. Then we'll talk about sea-care. And sea-care is what you use in the air. That's a good way to remember, right? Care in the air. So shortly before takeoff, I'm going to say strike the right chord to manage the risk for takeoff. I know it's a little corny. We're always looking for these ways to connect stuff together. So chord, what is that? So this is when we're flying in two-person operations, this is really the captain's brief. And this is dealing with things, and although it's listed that there's a lot of stuff here, really what it's doing is giving you the opportunity to look at what you did in PAVE and detect anything that's changed from what you planned. So we're always trying to detect changes from what we planned. And this is your last chance to take a look at anything that's different than you planned it. So if you go through conditions, hazards, operational changes, runway required, available, return, and your departure procedure, you now have had the opportunity to go through and review everything again and make sure that you're really ready to go. And usually this is not things that are going to cause you to not fly, but they are things that might result in changes or creating awareness that you might not have had just before getting ready to depart. So if we take a look at these, we look at conditions. The PAVE items that you're looking at is, again, pilot, aircraft, environment, external pressures, right? But you're looking at them again from a moment of getting ready to take off and trying to detect any changes that have happened. So you're going to brief yourself. This is once again your second self, who's the pilot monitoring, kind of briefing you about what's coming up. And then you're going to take a look at any particular hazards. And the hazards are things like weathers, maybe a thunderstorm has moved in off the end of the departure end of the runway, and you need to modify your departure plans. Might be fog, wind, traffic, airport or aircraft changes that have happened. So you're picking those up as hazards. And then what do you do with hazards? Well, you have operational changes. And so what are you going to do about it to mitigate those just before takeoff? It might be things, depending on the aircraft, you might have a flat position change. You might be just briefing yourself that there's a crosswind that you hadn't expected and you need some crosswind correction. Maybe there's a runway change that has changed something else. Whether you're going to do a rolling or stationary power up is one thing that we consider when flying the jet, but that also applies, I think, to propeller aircraft. So you're looking at, because of the things that are different than we planned, what operational changes are needed to address those. So that's the O in chord. Take a look at the runway required and available. So we know how much runway is needed from our takeoff calculations. We know how much is available from the charts. Do they match? And how much extra runway do we have? You can have other measures of expected performance, like time to 100 is one that we use. In a 172, it might be time to 40 knots. Whatever measure you have some measure whether you're getting the performance that you expected, or a liftoff point. I expect to be off by the midpoint or by taxiway Bravo. We should be off. If we're not off by taxiway Bravo, we're going to abort, because we're not getting the performance that we expected. So that's the runway. Return, how are you going to get back to the airport in case of an engine failure? And this is a really good one to consider, especially in single engine aircraft. And there's been a lot of discussion in the industry about turn back and turn back points. And the AOPA has a great video on turn back and how to determine the altitude at which you could turn back and safely return to the runway that you left. And I recommend that you look that up on YouTube. You can find it, just probably AOPA turn back or something like that. But you should have an idea of what's your minimum turn back altitude. And if you've determined that with your airplane you're going to have at least 1,000 feet before you turn back, then you need to figure out, well, what does that mean from this airport? So you need to add that 1,000 feet to the airport elevation so that you know by looking at your altimeter what altitude you're good at, because you're not going to have time to figure it out. Well, hold it. Do I have 1,000 feet? What was the airport elevation? And add it. You know, you need to have an idea immediately whether or not you can turn back, because the whole success of that scenario is that you turn back immediately. So you determine in advance, but you brief it as part of the core brief. You brief that altitude and which direction to turn, so on. So, and on the single engine no turn back, if you're below that altitude, assuming that you have an altitude like that, then you should know in advance where you would go. And you can do that very easily with satellite maps and that sort of thing these days. So you have an idea of the environment around you. If you lost an engine, where would you go? And you need to look at an area, if you're below your turn back altitude, of about 30 degrees. You know, you don't want to make turns beyond that. So you should have some idea of that. And you can brief that as part of your core briefing. If you're flying a multi-engine airplane, then there's some other considerations. You can think about having a departure alternate if the weather is below landing minimums at that airport. And think about where's the weather better at an airport that has a combination of better weather and has services available. And you can brief that. And then the last thing is the departure. And on the departure side, you're looking at it, this is based on, you don't have an engine failure. What's just your normal departure procedure? What are you going to do when you lift off the runway? And you want to brief that again. And that's your IFR clearance, initial turn, initial heading, initial altitude, so that you have those readily fresh in mind. And if you're VFR, you know, what route are you going to fly? What airspace considerations are there close by? Is there class Bravo? How do you avoid the class Bravo? And so you want to brief that, exactly what you're going to do on departure. So that's the core. And then while airborne is the take care, and we call it C care because the C is all about detecting changes, right? So now once you're airborne, you've gone through the pave, and this doesn't have to be a long, onerous process, right? You should be able to go through pave pretty quickly and go through the C care before you take off pretty quickly. Once it becomes a habit, it becomes automatic. You just go through it and go through the items without very much effort or very much thought. Once you're in the air, you're conducting risk surveillance, right? You're looking at changes. What is different than I had planned? So maybe you notice something like your ground speed is slower than you had planned. And in that case, you need to detect that change and then ask yourself, well, what does that mean? Well, it means you're going to arrive at your destination later than you planned, with less fuel, and maybe closer to sunset. You know, go through and think through those next layers. And so that's the consequences. What are the consequences of that change? So as soon as you get airborne, everything that you planned starts to change, right? Everything now that you planned as something static now becomes dynamic. Things are moving, and nothing ever goes according to plan. Some things that are different than planned are inconsequential, but anything that's changed and different needs to be looked at. So as soon as you get airborne, everything in PAVE starts changing, and you look at the consequences, and you'll want to think through the consequences of the changes. And you want to think down several levels, like that example of being slower on ground speed than you expected, landing with less fuel, potentially landing at night where you hadn't planned on it. And then you go through and ask yourself, well, am I qualified? Is the airplane qualified, or is the airport that we're landing on good at that? And that's the time to think about then what are your alternatives, right? What are the alternatives to what you planned? Well, you might have an alternative to land short of your destination. You might have an alternative to land at a different airport than you'd planned because they have better airport lighting. That's the kind of thinking that you want to go through. So you're thinking about the consequences down several levels, and this is the example we're going through. The other thing about something being different than you planned, like ground speed, when we're thinking that through these levels, is that if it's different than I had planned, the wind is different, probably the pressure patterns, things are different, the weather's operating, the environment that I'm flying in is operating differently than I planned. And oftentimes that means the weather might be worse than planned. So when things are different than you planned, you have to kind of think about the next level down, and the next level down below that. What does it mean? Consider your alternatives, and the most important consideration in aviation, always have an alternative, right? You need to always have alternatives in mind, because those alternatives give you options. And as you fly in, and you're going through sea care, but as you fly on your trip, in general, your alternatives are shrinking, right? You start out with this giant alternative. You got a airplane full of fuel. You can go anywhere. The weather's good. It's as I planned. But as things change, your alternatives change with them, and generally they become smaller. So you have to think about that. I always have alternatives, and keep your alternatives. For instance, on the, let's say you were going to land short on fuel. Your SOP is you're going to land with an hour of fuel, but now you're cutting into that. Maybe you're going to land with a half hour of fuel because you're slower ground speed, right? Well, how much does it take really to stop, add fuel, and then continue your flight? You've just expanded your alternatives, right? You've taken your alternatives have been shrinking. You land, add fuel, boom. They're right back. Even turning around and going all the way home it might be a possibility. So always have alternatives, and take action to keep or expand that circle of alternatives. Reality. This is an important one when you detect something that's changed, and everything in you is saying, "I'm going to complete this mission," right? And we tend to kind of maybe ignore the reality. So this is just a reminder. The R in care is deal with things as they are, not how you would want them to be, right? So it's just a little reminder. It's like, hold on, am I glossing over this? Makes you thoughtful, right? Just gives you a chance to have that second thought, right? So dealing with things, dealing with reality. So what's the biggest cause of cross-country fatalities? Does anybody in this room have a guess on that?
Fuel exhaustion.
What is it?
Fuel exhaustion.
Fuel exhaustion is up there. It's a high one. But the biggest cause of cross-country fatalities is continued VFR into worsening weather. And that's kind of the scenario that I was going through earlier. It's insidious because weather doesn't just go from good to bad. It slowly deteriorates. And at what point in that process of deterioration are you going to deal with the reality of it deteriorating, especially if you're a VFR pilot and don't have an IFR option, or even if you do have an IFR option? At what point are you going to decide, I'm going to call ATC and get an IFR clearance? Because there's been many, many accidents of IFR pilots continuing VFR flight into IMC and not exercising the privilege of their instrument certificate. Even climbing up, going ahead, taking the risk, climbing up into the cloud when you've got terrain ahead and doing a 180, and then calling ATC and saying, mea culpa, I'm IMC, I need a clearance. You're exercising your piloting command authority, and it could save your life. But some folks have not done that and paid that cost. So those are things to think about. When you're heading off into the cross country. So do pilots deliberately take off in weather they know will kill them? Absolutely not. No, you're foolish to do that. But how do you know? So I think that's where the risk management surveillance comes in. you look at it, you think about it ahead of time, and don't let your goal-oriented behavior drive you into the cockpit and take me off without having considered all of the elements associated with the risk for that flight. And it's a very sad story about somebody taking off out of a California airport along the coast in the north with their family on board. Took off, beautiful, clear skies above, but as we know that live in California, like myself, right off the coast there could be just fog bank. And sometimes that fog bank's really hard to see because of the sun and what have you, and what have you. Took off into the fog bank, VFR pilot, no IFR, significant IFR training, and ended up just gradually the visibility would have deteriorated as they entered the fog bank. And as we know, the result of that was as expected. So yeah, you don't deliberately take off into weather that you know would kill you, but it can happen that's the end result. So reality, when things change your plan. Deal with reality. The last one is external pressures. It's the same one as faith, right? It's just meant an opportunity to ask yourself, in my answers on this checklist, did I fudge them a little bit because I feel pressured in order to get to my destination? And then remember what I was saying about when you make a change based on mitigating risk, and you may not reach your destination in another week, another couple weeks, a month, certainly within a year, it's not going to matter. Your life will have gone on, and it won't be something that's a major event, right? So really think about those external and internal pressures. So feeling rushed is a sign that the pressures are getting to you. If you have that sense that you feel rushed. So going back to the beginning, goal orientation, it tends to make us keep going when good risk management says we should change our plan. And like I say, changing your plan doesn't necessarily mean canceling your flight. It just means taking a look at the risks and doing something about them that reduce the risk, that mitigate the risk. Everything we do has risk associated with it. And what we're trying to do is just get a better ratio of risk and reward by mitigating the risk and taking a look at it. So I didn't address this cartoon at the beginning of my talk where it appeared as well, but I think it's a great one. Pogo says here, we have met the enemy and he is us. So it's just a little reminder that most GA accidents, 75% plus, have to do with pilot error. And we need to keep that in mind. Airplanes we fly are very reliable. Not that they don't need their own risk surveillance, but we need to look at ourselves and do something about it. We can be proactive. We can take control. We can win at this. And the way that we win at it is by successfully looking for and managing the risks associated with the flight. And hopefully, I've given some tools to help you do that. Coming to terms with the tension, we don't need to be as rigid as the airlines. We have a lot of freedom in GA, and we want to exercise that freedom. We enjoy having it. We do have to accept reasonable limits on our utility, though. And I think as flight instructors, talk is obviously to a lot of flight instructors here at NAFI. I think one of the things that we have to be careful with when we have students that are coming to us with the goal of flying an airplane either recreationally or especially in their own business. They're not necessarily the airline aspirants. They want to use that aircraft. And sometimes our system is not as good at building people that are true PICs. And when I say PIC, I mean pilot in command. And a pilot in command is going to think about the risk associated with the flight and act on it. But sometimes we're focused on more the knowledge and the skills to get through the test. But if they're planning on using that airplane recreationally or especially for business, they need to accept some reasonable limitations on the utility. They have to understand right away they're not going to always make it to their destination, because especially the business use will drive a lot of folks to take on more risk than is necessary. And I think as flight instructors, we need to have some straight talk about aviation safety and about a utility of aircraft, of GA aircraft, in a world where we don't have all the guarantees of an airliner, of a Part 25 airplane that is built in with all kinds of redundancy and with all the higher level rules and regulations that are governing those flights and the dispatchers and more strict rules. We want to enjoy that freedom, but we need to accept some reasonable limitations. So to manage in-flight risks, create an SOP that develops a habit of using PAVE, CORD, and C-CARE. Make it your SOP. And if you use those 3 briefings, you may just catch that really important risk at one point in your flying career, and that may make all the difference. So thank you very much, and I apologize again you had to put up with me as opposed to John and Martha today, but I hope you're taking away something valuable from the talk. Thank you all.